The boy who never spoke. Until the day he saved the entire school, the acrid smell of smoke began to seep through the ventilation system of Roosevelt Elementary at exactly 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday that would forever change everything. Most students were too absorbed in their afternoon lessons to notice the faint gray wisps curling beneath classroom doors, but Lucas Martinez saw it immediately. He always noticed things others missed: the way shadows shifted when clouds passed overhead, the exact rhythm of the janitor's footsteps in the hallway, the precise moment when Mrs. Henderson's voice would crack during her reading of Charlotte's Web. Lucas had been watching the thin line of smoke creep across the linoleum floor for 37 seconds, his dark eyes tracking its movement with the same intensity he reserved for observing ants building their colonies during recess. "Lucas, can you please pay attention?" Mrs. Henderson's voice cut through his concentration like a blade through silk. The 11-year-old boy with unruly black hair and clothes that never quite fit properly slowly lifted his gaze from the floor to meet her exasperated stare. 23 pairs of eyes turned toward him, some filled with familiar mockery, others with indifference, and a few with the casual cruelty that children wielded like weapons. "I asked you a question about the main character's motivation." Lucas's mouth opened slightly as if he might speak, but then closed again, just as it had every day for the past 3 years since his family had moved to this town. The silence stretched like a taut wire, filled with the soft rustling of papers and the distant hum of the heating system that was now carrying something far more dangerous than warm air. Behind Lucas, Tommy Rodriguez whispered just loud enough for half the class to hear, "Freak can't even talk like a normal person." The comment sparked a ripple of suppressed laughter that made Lucas's shoulders tense imperceptibly. He had learned to make himself small, to fold inward like origami, to become invisible in plain sight. But invisibility was a double-edged sword. It protected him from attention he didn't want, yet it also meant that when he tried to signal danger, no one listened. His hand rose tentatively, pointing toward the smoke that was now clearly visible, curling like ghostly fingers around the base of the door. Mrs. Henderson followed his gesture with irritated eyes, then froze as she saw what he had been trying to show them. The color drained from her face as the fire alarm's piercing wail suddenly shattered the afternoon quiet, sending 24 hearts racing and 24 minds into panic mode. Chaos erupted instantaneously. Chairs scraped against linoleum as students bolted upright, their carefully organized world dissolving into mayhem. Sarah Kim screamed as she knocked over her desk, sending crayons and pencils clattering across the floor like scattered bones. The twins, Marcus and Maya, collided with each other in their desperate rush toward the door, while little Emma Santos began crying with the raw, primal terror that only children possess. Mrs. Henderson's training kicked in, her voice rising above the alarm as she tried to maintain order. "Single file. Walk, don't run. Everyone stay calm." But her own hands were shaking as she reached for the door handle, and when she pulled it open, a wall of thick, black smoke billowed into the classroom like a living thing, hungry and suffocating. The emergency lights flickered on, casting everything in an eerie red glow that made the smoke appear even more ominous, and suddenly the familiar classroom felt like a trap with walls closing in from all sides. Lucas remained seated while pandemonium swirled around him, his mind processing information with the calculating precision of a computer. The smoke was too thick in the main hallway. The primary exit was compromised. The windows were painted shut and too high for the younger children to reach safely. Mrs. Henderson was coughing now, her authority crumbling as fast as her composure, and Lucas could see the exact moment when she realized that her emergency procedures weren't going to work. 23 of his classmates looked to their teacher for salvation, but Lucas was looking at something else entirely. The maintenance access panel in the corner of the room that he had observed the janitor use countless times, the one that led to a service corridor most people had forgotten existed. For 3 years, he had been silent, observing, cataloging, learning every secret pathway and hidden corner of this building. Now, as smoke continued to pour through the doorway and his classmates' panic reached a fever pitch, Lucas Martinez faced the most crucial decision of his young life: remain invisible and safe, or step forward and become the voice that could save them all. The answer came in the form of a single clear word that cut through the chaos like a lighthouse beam piercing fog. "Stop." Lucas's voice, unused for so long, cracked slightly on the syllable, but it carried an authority that made every person in the room freeze mid-panic. Mrs. Henderson's eyes widened in shock, not just at the danger they were in, but at the realization that the boy she had assumed was mute had just spoken with more command than she had managed in her 15 years of teaching. "The hallway is blocked," Lucas continued, his words measured and deliberate, each one chosen with the precision of someone who had spent years thinking before speaking. "But there's another way." He stood slowly from his desk, and for the first time since anyone could remember, every eye in the classroom was focused on him, not with mockery or indifference, but with desperate hope. The smoke continued to pour in, and somewhere in the distance, they could hear the ominous crackling sound that meant the fire was spreading faster than anyone had anticipated. Sarah Kim, tears streaming down her face, was the first to break the stunned silence. "Lucas can talk," she whispered, but her question was immediately overshadowed by Tommy Rodriguez's panicked shout. "Who cares if he can talk? We're all going to die in here." The smoke was getting thicker by the second, and several students had begun coughing violently. Mrs. Henderson tried to take control again, but her voice was weak and strained. "Children, we need to follow emergency protocol But Lucas interrupted her with a gentle shake of his head, moving toward the maintenance panel with the fluid grace of someone who had mentally rehearsed this moment 1,000 times. "The protocols won't work," he said simply, his fingers already working at the access panel screws with a small tool he had pulled from his pocket. A multi-tool that his father had given him years ago, which he carried everywhere but had never used in front of others. "I've been watching. The fire started in the electrical room near the main exit. The sprinkler system failed 3 minutes ago. The smoke is too thick in the primary evacuation routes." As Lucas worked, his classmates began to see him differently. Not as the weird quiet kid, but as someone who had been paying attention to details they had never noticed. Emma Santos, still sniffling but no longer crying, asked in a small voice, "How do you know all that?" Lucas paused in his work, his dark eyes meeting hers for a moment that seemed to stretch forever. "Because I watch everything," he replied simply. "When you don't talk, you learn to see." The maintenance panel came free with a metallic click, revealing a narrow service corridor that disappeared into darkness. The space looked impossibly small, and Mrs. Henderson immediately protested. "We can't send children into there. It's too dangerous." But Lucas was already testing the airflow, his nose detecting the subtle difference in the smoke density. "It leads to the gymnasium," he explained, his voice growing stronger with each word. "The corridor runs parallel to the main building, away from the electrical fire. There are emergency exits on the gym's east side that most people don't know about." He turned to face the class, and in that moment, something fundamental shifted in the classroom dynamic. Lucas Martinez was no longer the outcast, he was their lifeline. The decision to trust him wasn't unanimous. Marcus, one of the twins, backed away from the opening. "How do we know he's not just making this up? What if he's wrong?" His fear was palpable, and it spread like contagion to several other students who began to murmur anxiously among themselves. But Maya, his twin sister, stepped forward decisively. "Look around, Marcus. Look at the smoke. Listen to the fire getting closer. Do you have a better plan?" Her words carried weight because Maya was known as the practical one, the problem solver. And if she trusted Lucas, maybe they all should. Mrs. Henderson was torn between her training and the reality of their situation. But when a fresh wave of smoke rolled in and she heard glass breaking somewhere down the hallway, her decision was made. "Lucas," she said, her voice trembling but determined, "if you're wrong about this." He met her gaze steadily, and for the first time since she had known him, she saw not a withdrawn, strange child, but a young man carrying the weight of responsibility far beyond his years. "I'm not wrong," he said quietly. "But we have to move now. The fire is spreading faster than I calculated." What happened next would haunt the dreams and fuel the nightmares of everyone present for years to come. As Lucas prepared to lead the first group into the maintenance corridor, a sound echoed through the building that made everyone's blood run cold. A deep, rumbling groan followed by a tremendous crash that shook the entire structure. The lights flickered once, twice, then went out completely, plunging them into a darkness so absolute it felt like being swallowed alive. Emergency lighting cast everything in hellish red shadows, and through the walls, they could hear something that sounded like a freight train approaching at full speed. "The roof," Lucas whispered, his face pale in the crimson glow. Part of the roof just collapsed. Mrs. Henderson's hand flew to her mouth as the full implications hit her. They weren't just dealing with a simple fire anymore. The building's structural integrity was compromised. And if Lucas was wrong about the service corridor, if it led them into a trap instead of to safety, then the boy who had finally found his voice might have just led them all to their deaths. The maintenance corridor yawned before them like the mouth of a cave, dark and uncertain, while behind them the classroom filled with smoke and the promise of certain doom. Time was running out, choices were narrowing, and everything now depended on trusting a boy who had spent 3 years as a ghost in their midst. What Lucas saw in the beam of his flashlight wasn't debris or structural damage. It was a small, huddled figure pressed against the corridor wall, barely breathing and covered in soot. It was Kevin Walsh, the kindergartner who had been reported missing during the initial evacuation, the child that search teams had been frantically looking for while assuming he had already made it outside. "Kevin," Lucas whispered, his voice carrying a gentleness that surprised everyone behind him. The 6-year-old boy was conscious but clearly in shock, his big blue eyes reflecting the flashlight beam like a trapped animal's. Without hesitation, Lucas crawled into the narrow space, his movements careful and deliberate as he reached the frightened child. "Hey, buddy," he said softly, his voice steady despite the chaos surrounding them. "I'm Lucas. I'm going to get you out of here, okay?" Kevin nodded weakly, and as Lucas gently lifted him, the little boy whispered something that made Lucas's blood run cold. "The bad man. He told me to hide here. He said the fire was an accident, but I saw him with the matches." The implications hit Lucas like a physical blow. This wasn't just a tragic accident. Someone had deliberately set Roosevelt Elementary on fire, and Kevin had witnessed it all. But there was no time to process this revelation fully, because behind them, Mrs. Henderson was organizing the evacuation with military precision, guided by Lucas's calm instructions. "Sarah and Emma go first, then the twins, then Tommy," Lucas directed, his voice carrying an authority that transformed their panic into purposeful action. One by one, his classmates crawled through the maintenance corridor, following the path that Lucas had memorized during countless lonely lunch periods when he had explored every hidden corner of the school. The corridor was cramped and filled with dust, but it was clear of smoke, and more importantly, it led them away from the inferno that was consuming the main building. As they moved, Lucas carried Kevin on his back, whispering reassurances to the traumatized child while simultaneously coordinating the rescue of his classmates. Mrs. Henderson, bringing up the rear, watched in amazement as the boy she had dismissed as troubled and antisocial became the leader they all needed. "How did you know about this passage?" she asked as they crawled. Lucas's answer was simple but profound. "When you're invisible, you see everything. I've been mapping this building for 3 years, just in case I ever needed to disappear completely. I never thought I'd need it to save everyone else." 27 minutes after Lucas had first spoken the words "stop," they emerged through an emergency exit in the gymnasium that most people had forgotten existed. Fresh air hit their faces like a blessing, and one by one, they stumbled into the afternoon sunlight where firefighters and paramedics immediately surrounded them. The scene outside was chaos. Fire trucks, ambulances, news crews, and hundreds of frantic parents searching for their children. But as word spread that 24 people had been rescued from Classroom 7, and that the rescue had been led by Lucas Martinez, the quiet boy who never spoke, something extraordinary happened. The crowd fell silent, then burst into spontaneous applause. Reporters rushed toward Lucas, cameras flashing, microphones thrust in his direction, but he shrank back from the attention, overwhelmed by the sudden spotlight. It was Tommy Rodriguez, the same boy who had called him a freak just an hour earlier, who stepped forward and said the words that would be quoted in newspapers across the country. "Lucas didn't just save our lives. He showed us that the people we ignore might be the ones who save us when it matters most." The investigation that followed revealed the truth behind Kevin's whispered words. A disturbed former employee had indeed set the fire deliberately, targeting the electrical room to make it look accidental. Security footage confirmed Kevin's account, and the man was arrested within hours. But what shook the community to its core wasn't just the fact that someone had tried to burn down their school. It was the realization that if Lucas Martinez hadn't been paying attention, if he hadn't spent 3 years silently observing and learning every detail of the building, if he hadn't found his voice at exactly the right moment, 24 innocent people would have died. The local news picked up the story, then national outlets, and suddenly Lucas became known as the silent hero, the boy whose quiet observation had saved lives. Awards were given, ceremonies held, and Lucas was invited to speak at schools across the state about the power of watching, listening, and being prepared to act when others need you most. But perhaps the most profound change was in Classroom 7 itself, when they returned to their new temporary location. The dynamics had shifted permanently. Lucas was no longer invisible, no longer the weird kid in the corner. He had become their protector, their friend, and their reminder that strength comes in many forms. 3 months later, Lucas Martinez stood in front of Roosevelt Elementary's newly rebuilt entrance, reading a bronze plaque that bore his name and the names of his 23 classmates. The inscription read, "In honor of Lucas Martinez and the students of Classroom 7, who proved that heroes come in all forms, and that sometimes the quietest voices carry the most important messages." As he read, Kevin Walsh, now fully recovered and back in kindergarten, ran up and hugged his legs tightly. "Thank you for saving me, Lucas," the little boy said, and Lucas smiled, ruffling Kevin's hair. "Thank you for trusting me," he replied. But what nobody knew, what Lucas had never told anyone, was that he still carried his father's multi-tool every day, still observed every exit and emergency route wherever he went, and still noticed things others missed. Because Lucas Martinez had learned something that day that would stay with him forever. Being prepared to help others wasn't just about knowledge or tools or escape routes. It was about being brave enough to step forward when the moment called for it, even when you'd spent your whole life learning how to disappear. The boy who never spoke had found his voice, and in doing so, had taught an entire community that the most powerful words are often the ones that save lives. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button right now. Because stories like this remind us that heroes walk among us every single day, often invisible until the moment we need them most. What did you think of Lucas's transformation? Were you shocked by the twist about the arsonist? Drop a comment below and tell me, what would you have done in Lucas's position? And here's something that will blow your mind. Comment below with your city and country. I want to see how far this story of the silent hero has traveled around the world. Are you watching from New York, Tokyo, Sao Paulo, London? Let me know. Don't forget to like this video if Lucas's courage inspired you, and share it with someone who needs to hear that being different isn't a weakness. It's often our greatest strength.